Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. Today we're going to be going over some lab material. If you're watching this video and you're enrolled in my class, then you need to know what I cover. If you're not enrolled in my class, you may have additional structures or fewer structures or slightly different things. Either way, if you find my videos helpful, please hit like and subscribe. Now, I have a vertebral column here. I'm kind of zoomed out. I usually have these boxes here to provide a black background against which these bones will pop or stick out, but I just don't have the opportunity to do it the way that I like in an impromptu setup. So anyway, we have the vertebral column. I've drawn out the vertebral column. Hopefully you've watched that video of me talking about the vertebrae, the individual vertebrae and the structures. Now I have another model that I'm gonna stand up and show you here. And the reason I'm gonna do it this way is because I don't have a stand that holds this properly, and this one's getting pretty delicate. This is real human bone. And it shows you the vertebral column, and it shows you the pelvic girdle, how it's attached at the sacroiliac joint, the joint between the sacrum and the ilium. It also shows you how the sternum and the ribs and the scapulae, the pectoral girdle, interact with the axial skeleton and where they form their joints, okay? So now, when I look at the back here, I can see all of the vertebrae that we discussed or listed before. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, each with a rib attached, the 5 lumbar, the 5 sacral, and then the 4 coccygeal. The coccyx is tucked underneath a little bit, but that would be the coccyx, okay? And one of the things I want you to see is we're going to cover first the sternum and the ribs. Now the Latin term for rib is costa or costa, C-O-S-T-A. Now, these are called the costal bones, or the ribs, and the cartilages. Now, this is a ceramic material that's holding the ribs to the sternum, but there would be some hyaline cartilage here, and those cartilages would be called the costal cartilages. Okay, so all of these are the costal cartilages. The sternum is this bone right down the middle here, and it's actually 3 separate pieces of bone that fuse into one. This top part is called the manubrium. The long part here would be called the body of the sternum, and then the little tip that sticks down there is called the xiphoid process. It's spelled X-I-P-H-O-I-D. If you're trying to follow along, we're on pages 18 and 19 on my list of things to know. So we have the manubrium, the body of the sternum, and the xiphoid process, and the whole thing would be called the sternum. We have the costal cartilages, and then we have the costal bones or ribs. Now there are 12 pairs of ribs. If I look at the first 7 from the top down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, if I look at them carefully, they are all attached to the transverse process on what's called the transverse facet or the costal facet, which is a little smooth spot. I'm going to show you that on the individual ones. But these bones, the first 7, extend from the vertebrae posteriorly directly to the sternum with their cartilages. So the first 7 ribs are called vertebral ribs. They're called vertebrosternal ribs because they go from the vertebrae to the sternum. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay? Now, the next 3 ribs connect from the vertebrae posteriorly to the cartilage of number 7. Those are called vertebrochondral ribs. Chondro meaning cartilage. So number 8, 9, and 10 are called vertebrochondral ribs because they don't connect directly to the sternum. They connect to the cartilage of number 7, which connects to the sternum. That's why the first 7 sometimes are called true ribs, and then the next 3 are called false ribs. These are truly connected. These are falsely connected. Now in lab, you have to use the technical term or the anatomical term, and we'll use vertebrosternal or vertebrochondral ribs. Now I'm going to lift this guy up a little bit because the last 2 ribs are not connected anteriorly to anything. The tip of them is just kind of floating in space. Since they're only connected to the vertebrae posteriorly, these are called vertebral ribs. So 12 pairs of ribs. The first 7 are vertebrosternal ribs. 8, 9, and 10 are vertebrochondral ribs. And 11 and 12 are called vertebral ribs. And we'll have models like this to ask you to identify the individual types of ribs or identify parts of the sternum, okay? Anyway, now, let me set this guy down very gently because he is the real deal. And This is the sternum that comes from your from the boxes that our students study with, and we're going to talk about this a little bit. You can see here, I'm going to get this one a little bit closer. You can see the manubrium, you can see the body of the sternum, and you can see the xiphoid process. And then these would all be the costal cartilages. And I have this model here just to show you something really cool and interesting. You can see the actual spinal nerves sticking out of the intervertebral foramen, and you can see the intervertebral discs, these little spongy pads in here. So if I ask you to identify that structure, that's an intervertebral disc. These would be the nerves, but the opening that they're coming out of would be called the intervertebral foramen. This model actually shows you a bulged or herniated disc impinging on a nerve. It's kind of cool to look at. So it shows you the orientation of everything. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to set all this stuff aside, and I'm going to zoom in on the individual vertebrae. I got a whole pile of individual vertebrae here, and I'm going to talk about their structures. In order for me to do that, I want to zoom in a little bit so that you guys can see exactly what I'm talking about. Which means my ugly face is going to be cut out of the picture most of the time, but that's okay. I have a face made for radio. All right, so maybe you can see me, maybe you can't. Anyway, I have a whole bunch of vertebrae here. If I pick up any generic vertebra, doesn't matter which one I pick up, you should be able to see these anatomical features. You can see this part is called the body. The hole here would be called the vertebral foramen. And then I have two transverse processes sticking off the side, and I have a spinous process sticking off the back. If I look at it from a lateral view, I can see the body and I can see the spinous process. Most likely this would be a lumbar vertebrae because of the size and the shape. Okay? Let me just grab another random one. I can tell you already that this would be a thoracic vertebra because I can see that the spinous process points down and the transverse processes point backwards. One other clue is I see a little smooth spot right here on the transverse processes where the head of a rib would articulate, and that's called the costal facet. Okay? If I look at it from this view, by the way, I can see the superior articular facet, this piece sticking up, and the inferior articular facet, this piece sticking down. I would also have it on this rib, on this vertebra. This structure right here, that smooth spot would be the superior articular facet, and this would be the inferior articular facet. I hope you can see that. Now, if I look at these, again, this one has the body, the vertebral foramen, two transverse processes, and a spinous process. If I hold this one up, it has a body, it has a vertebral foramen, two transverse processes, and a spinous process sticking off here. That's got to be thoracic because it looks like the letter T first and foremost, or the spine points down. This is lumbar. I can tell because there's no costal facets and it's got that little handle like a little coffee cup. Now, I can tell you for sure that this one is cervical vertebra. And the reason I can tell is there's the body, there's the two transverse processes. I can see holes in the transverse process called a transverse foramen. Okay, so I hope you can see that. And then this would be the spinous process and the vertebral foramen. If it's got three holes, it's got to be cervical. And you can see the spinous process sticks almost straight out. There is a superior and an inferior articular facet that you can see. So if I just close my eyes and randomly grab one of these, I can take a good look at it and say this is a lumbar vertebrae. I can name all the parts: body, transverse process, spinous process, vertebral foramen. And looks like a little espresso cup. Again, I'm going to purposely choose one that's cervical. It's got three holes. Must be cervical. That one must be cervical. It's got three holes in it. So it's a cervical vertebra. This one has to be thoracic. This one has to be thoracic. You can tell the different vertebrae from each other. Now, one of the things that I didn't show you in the other video, or maybe I did, was that the first two cervical vertebrae each get a special name. They're called the atlas and the axis. And I can tell if I have them in my hand or not by looking at them if I look for certain features. In Greek mythology, Atlas was a guy who angered the gods, and so the gods punished him by making him bear the weight of the world on his shoulders. And so there's always pictures of Atlas holding the earth on his shoulders, which would be exhausting if you had to do that for eternity. And when we look at the first cervical vertebrae, you know, the vertebrae are named C1, C2, C3 for cervical 1, cervical 2, cervical 3. There's 7 cervical. And then they switch names to T1, T2, T3, all the way through T12. And then there's L1, L2, L3 through L5. You even have the 5 sacral that, even though they're fused, they're S1, S2, S3, S4, and S5. So let me grab something here. Oops. I have the sacrum here. And while on this model it's not drilled out, the sacral canal would be running right here. This is the sacrum. Okay, and you can see where the nerves should be extending here. So when someone says we need an x-ray of C1, C2, C3, you know you're going to be doing an x-ray of the top vertebrae. Now, cervical vertebra number 1 is not only called C1, it's also called the atlas. And when I look at it, one of the distinguishing features is it does not have a spine and it does not have a body. It looks like a big O with 2 extra transverse processes and transverse foramina. And there are some articular facets here. There's the superior articular facets, which are more dished out because that's where the condyles of the skull, the occipital condyles, sit and allow your skull to rock. And then there's the inferior articular facets, which are on the bottom. But you can easily tell you're looking at the atlas. If we ask you for the name of this vertebrae, you would say atlas, because there's no spinous process and no body. Now, over time, the body of C1 actually got transferred somehow, genetically, biochemically, physically, we don't know, to C2, called the the axis. Atlas is C1, axis is C2. It's called the axis because the way that the atlas sits on it allows the atlas to rotate even more, pivoting so that we can turn our head further around. That's excellent for survival and reproduction, for evolution. If you're trying to, take a drink at the stream and something's going to sneak up behind you, you want to be able to look over your shoulder and then take off running. You don't want to have to turn and look at it and then turn back around. You would get killed. Or if you're trying to check out a mate, you walk by someone, you might turn and take a look instead of having to turn around and get busted and get in trouble or get embarrassed or whatever it is. So that's part of our human biology. Now, I can tell the axis because it has this little knot or bump sticking up on the top. And I can see the superior and the inferior articular facets. I can see that it has 3 holes. It has 2 transverse foramina, just like any other cervical vertebra. But that little bump sticking up off the top is called the odontoid process, or it's also called the dens, D-E-N-S. Den referring to tooth, it looks like a single little tooth sticking up. So anyway, you can tell the atlas and you can tell the axis when you're looking at them, and you should be able to tell the other types of vertebrae. Those are some of the things that we could ask about. Now finally, the last thing I want to cover with y'all is this. Give me a second to find my model. This is a mid-sagittal section of the skull, and the top of the skull has been removed here. But what it shows us is what are called the 4 paranasal sinuses. We have 4 sinus cavities that surround, actually there's 5 because there's 2 of one of them. But there's some sinuses that surround the opening called the nasal cavity. So they're called paranasal sinuses. Turns out they're all named for the bone that they're found in. For example, this would be the frontal bone here. And if I turn the model sideways, you can see this empty space here would be right above and between your eyes. When you get a sinus headache there, that's because you have mucus impacting the membranes in there. So that's called the frontal sinus. Now, sitting deep here, when we learn the skull, we learn nasal, maxillary, lacrimal, and ethmoid runs back here. So this is the inside of the ethmoid bone, and you can see all these little tiny pockets, air pockets in here. Those are called the ethmoidal sinuses. If I go straight behind them, this big empty space here is in the sphenoid bone. I can see the sella turcica here. This sphenoid bone has the sphenoidal sinus. And then finally, this would be the maxillary bone here. If I turn it sideways, there's a big empty space in the maxillary bone called the maxillary sinus. So we have frontal, ethmoidal, maxillary, and sphenoidal. To me, it spells the word FEMS. F-E-M-S. Frontal, ethmoidal, maxillary, sphenoidal sinuses. Okay? So, now, I hope you learned the sternum. I hope you learned the ribs. I hope you learned the vertebrae. I hope you learned the 4 paranasal sinuses. And I hope you had as much fun as I did. So, do this stuff till you can't stand it. Do it till you understand it. Do it till you can teach it from someone else. You should be able to pick this stuff up and teach one of your classmates. So take the pictures, download them, practice labeling them until you can't stand it, until you're ready to make an A on your lab test. Okay? Thanks for watching. Again, I hope you had as much fun as I did. See you in the next video.